Hi everybody, how are you doing? I have so much personality, don't I? We're currently in the middle of my Voddie Proves the Bible Again series, and I hope you're just having a wonderful time and learning a ton. Today we're going to open up with Voddie suggesting there's a problem with people nowadays.
A reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. But there's a problem. And here's the problem. The problem is, we're all educated people, and unfortunately we're overeducated people.
So the problem is we're too educated. Yup.
Because we have truth and lies and everything else. And because we're overeducated people, all of us believe we know things about this claim. This whole claim that, we have a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. That's not exactly true. This stuff was actually written later. I mean, isn't that right? Haven't we heard that this stuff was written later?
How is this problem caused by people being too educated? If, as Voddie's implying, people think the Bible was written at a later date than it actually was according to the best available data, then the problem is that they're misinformed. So wouldn't the solution be to provide them more education so they can be better informed? When Voddie suggests a solution might be less education, it seems he's unnerved about what the pursuit of actual knowledge will reveal, and thus just wants people to default to the safety of a traditional narrative.
And then there's this Constantine guy, and he puts stuff together, and then he said, get rid of other stuff, and, all this sort of stuff. And so there are a couple of things that we need to deal with when we talk about the Bible in this way. Again, a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses.
I can't tell whether his annoying habit of randomly repeating this is meant to drive it home with his audience or give him a chance to gather his thoughts.
I'm claiming that the Bible's written early. I'm claiming that the New Testament is written early. I'm claiming that the New Testament is done with by the end of the first century. Early, maybe into the second century, depending on how you date Revelation. But that it's early. That it's very early.
Great. But the trick is that early is a very imprecise term, and saying that the New Testament was done with by the end of the first century or probably into the second can suggest misleading conclusions even if it's totally true. First off, while the writings may have been completed, they weren't done with in the sense that they were selected and understood to be scripture. They were just circulating among Christian communities along with a ton of other works that aren't so well remembered today. Because the church threw them out for being heretical. And second, it doesn't really establish that much. I'm willing to grant that, fine, all the books of the New Testament were written sometime within the first century. What does that show us? Sure, this date is early compared to the span of history, but it still leaves people writing about stuff up to 70 years after the fact. And that's a long time for word of mouth to turn into inaccurate and far-fetched oral tradition. For context, imagine we lived in a mostly pre-literate society with the general population not having regular access even to libraries, much less to daily media. Imagine how out of control verbal stories might get. Imagine how quickly we'd be drawn to and come to believe urban legends told by the most skilled storytellers, and how hard it would be to fact-check these legends. Think about the absolutely batshit things people today believe about events within the same year, and that's with abundant fact-checking resources. Without the internet, TV, or even much in the way of books to follow up on, it would be madness. So imagine that within this environment, people were just now writing about things that had taken place in the 1950s or 60s. It would be all over the place. Now, would we know the writings were inaccurate? I guess not. But should we consider them a reliable record of the past, especially when they start writing about far-fetched supernatural events? No. The fact is, the documents we have today could be totally accurate recreations of what was written within the first century, yet still be riddled with legend. In fact, while not necessarily thinking the writings are totally true to the originals, I do think they've been preserved remarkably well going back to the early days of church history. But all this tells us is that the church was fastidious about collecting and preserving its writings. That's it. And taking this as an indicator that we should believe some first century dude who wrote that something supernatural happened 50 years ago is really just kinda nuts. Keep that in mind as we move forward, because a lot of what Voddie says relies on beating the shit out of silly arguments about the Bible being changed late in Christian history, while trying to slip a weird assumption past us, which is that we should find the supernatural claims of any early document believable. First, he goes after some weird argument about the Bible being changed in the process of translation, which I don't think is a realistic criticism brought up by many informed skeptics.
And there are those people who are, they're going to argue against this on a couple of different fronts. I'll deal with the easier one first, that the Bible is not reliable because it's been translated so many times. Because the Bible's been translated so many times, and they'll say it's like a game of telephone. All right? The game has different names in different parts of the world, okay? But the game, you whisper into the ear of this person, and then he whispers into his ear. And so this is the argument that they make about the Bible being translated so many times and about us not being able to trust the Bible because of how many times it was translated. This bothers me a great deal. It bothers me a great deal that there are people who claim to be intelligent who continue to make this argument.
What bothers me is that there are pastors who say intelligent people make this argument, or at least Voddie's iteration of it.
And it bothers me that there are Christians who don't laugh at them.
I'm not surprised to hear Voddie's bothered when Christians don't laugh at skeptics.
Because here's the problem. If I am the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic manuscripts, I don't just whisper into his ear and then everybody else have to hear what I told him. See, I'm reading from the English Standard Version. This translation was done in the early 2000s. They didn't just go back to the next oldest translation and translate from that. They went to the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic manuscripts themselves, which means the game actually goes like this. I speak to him, and then I speak to him, and then I speak to him, and then I speak to him, and I speak to him, 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 and then I speak to him, so that when he says what he heard, it's the same thing that guy heard because he got it from the same source.
While I'm not 100% certain of all the details, this is more or less how I view the history of the Bible in biblical translation. We do have some early manuscripts of the Bible. Again, early in terms of the scope of Christian history, not in terms of recording the first mention of a supernatural event, and translators generally go back as far as they can when looking for manuscripts to make their translations from. Now, do differences arise in the process of translation? Sure, but most of them are incredibly minor and don't do much, if anything, to affect the message of the Bible. Trust me, I say this as someone who had every difference pointed out to me by rabid King James onlyists when I was a Christian. Now, I can't say scholars never address issues introduced by the Bible's translation history, but I've never seen it put forward as a major reason for doubting the claims of the New Testament. The fact is, there's plenty of reason to doubt tales of a demigod rising from the dead without needing to go there. So this whole point he's belaboring, while maybe not a straw man, is just kind of superfluous.
That's why people who make this argument are either ignorant or they're evil or both.
Or there's another option, which is that they don't exist because you made them up. He continues expressing his frustration with what these totally real people said before moving on to some pretty standard talking points, first about the age of the documents we currently have.
Yeah, well, the documents that we have are just late documents and we don't know what there were in those earlier documents. Okay. All right. Let's look at that for a moment, shall we? When we're talking about the manuscripts themselves, because there are some issues that we have to talk about there. When it comes to the Bible, it's true, we don't have originals because of the material that these originals were written on.
Now, this might not be a super important point, but why does he say we don't have the New Testament originals? Because of the materials they are written on. Keep that in mind here for a minute.
We don't have originals. But let's limit ourselves tonight just to the New Testament, shall we? Just when we're talking about the New Testament, we don't have any originals. But we do have documents that date back as early as AD 120, AD 100 to AD 120. That's within a couple of decades of the completion of the New Testament.
Now, I find this a little strange. Remember how Voddie told us we don't have the originals of the New Testament because of the materials they are written on? How could you not? I told you to remember, and it was less than 30 seconds ago. Yet here he's telling us that we have documents that date back to, according to him, a couple decades after the completion of the New Testament. Do you see the issue? If the material ancient manuscripts are written on is so bad we don't have any surviving originals, then how do we have copies from mere decades later? How would they have survived if they were from basically the same time and written on similar materials? Well, for one, there are some issues both with the accuracy and semantics of how he represents the issue. First, his statement that we have documents dating back as early as AD 120 is very liberally estimating the age of our extant manuscripts. Providing precise dates for manuscripts is difficult, and experts say the oldest one could actually date as recent as early in the 3rd century. Second, the document he's talking about is this scrap of close to nothing called P52, so we need to be very careful not to let him give the impression that we have an entire or even significant portion of documents going back that far. Third, his couple decades phrasing cleverly gives his audience the impression of a 20-year gap between originals and manuscripts without actually committing to the number, and this is extremely far-fetched, especially considering we could be looking at a gap closer to 100 years. So while I'm not an expert and nailing down these dates is difficult even for those who are, one thing to keep in mind when comparing the survival of copies and originals is that they're likely not as close in age as he lets on. Still though, even a gap of 100 or even a couple hundred years probably doesn't account for it, right? Not when the copies lasted almost 2 millennia. So what was it? One thing we need to consider is what the documents were to Christians at the time and how they were treated. The originals of what we now call the New Testament were not considered scripture when they were written. To the people of the time, they were letters or compilations of oral tradition that would have been passed around, read, and stored as casually as any other document. Now, I don't mean to imply they were treated carelessly. No documents were back then. But they were going to be subject to normal wear and tear, as well as to being scrubbed so the valuable papyrus could be reused. However, as the decades passed, some of these documents, the ones that weren't ignored or actively destroyed as heretical, started to be recognized as sacred then as scriptural canon, and it's here that methodical measures were taken to keep them preserved. So with his observation, Voddie stumbled upon an important point that actually undermines his case, and that's that there's an all too mundane explanation for why we have a lot of copies of early New Testament manuscripts, which is that the church did 2 things. 1, it painstakingly preserved writings it considered holy, and 2, it went out to become the dominant religion of Western civilization. This can very neatly explain why we don't have originals, yet we suddenly see an impressive number of extant copies starting mere decades later. And it also totally derails another entire line of argumentation Voddie will eventually use.
We can go back and put our hands on documents that were dated within a couple of decades of the completion of the New Testament.
Well, good on the church, I guess. It really is impressive that they so painstakingly produce and preserve copies of documents that were important to them. But it has literally nothing to do with the truth of any claim. If I don't care that some ancient dude wrote that a supernatural thing happened 50 years earlier, why do I care that other people accurately copied what he wrote?
How many manuscripts do we have? The New Testament, we have over 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts in the New Testament. Over 6,000. Over 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts. And we can go back to within a couple of decades of the last writings.
So, the fact that the church made a lot of copies of its stories just shows that, well, it had the institutional power and determination to do so. But if we're talking about the truth of those stories, this is even less relevant than the span of time between the originals and the oldest surviving copies, which, if you'll remember, tend to be tiny remnants of a single page. Because the vast majority of these 6,000 manuscripts came over 1,000 years after Christ. Hell, they were still being written after Columbus sailed to the Americas. So tell me, Voddie, what does it mean if a bunch of guys were sitting in a scriptorium in the 1500s mass-producing copies of Scripture? I mean, it's an impressive undertaking to be sure, but let's appreciate it for that without trying to imply that a religion dominating an area of the world and then using its resources to make a lot of copies of its stories means we should believe those stories. I mean, seriously, if the medieval church had been half as productive, would the Bible's mere 3,000 manuscripts give us less certainty that Jesus had risen from the dead? This whole thing is just plain silly, and it's kind of sad that this is such a staple of over-the-pulpit apologetics. I talk about this a lot more in my old video, A Fistful of Manuscripts, so feel free to go check it out.
If that doesn't sound impressive to you, it's because you don't deal with ancient writings.
Or you have a common sense understanding of what it means that people did the medieval version of a lot of photocopying.
For example, if we're talking about Aristotle's Poetics, we have less than a dozen manuscripts of Aristotle's Poetics, and the earliest one that we can go back to is over 1,000 years after the writing. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. Again, less than a dozen. And it's over 1,000 years between the last writing and the first manuscript we can put our hands on. The best example that we have in terms of number of documents is Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad, we have a few hundred manuscripts, but the earliest one we can put our hands on was written 2,100 years after the original.
Right. And just as the volume of New Testament manuscripts tells us nothing more than that Christian culture dominated the West and reproduced Scripture on an industrial scale, while neurotically preserving every scrap so they wouldn't desecrate something holy, the smaller number of manuscripts we have of Aristotle, Caesar, or Homer tells us nothing more than that there was no such apparatus devoted to copying and preserving them. Is this difficult to understand? The dynamic here could be similar to the one that caused us to lose the originals of the New Testament while still remaining the copies that came fairly soon after. Just like the originals, these non-Christian works were likely subjected to normal use and the wear and tear that accompanied them, and as a consequence they didn't survive too long. There was no reason to preserve a fading copy of Aristotle. You'd scrub the writing and try to reuse the valuable papyrus. There's no reason to hold on to a scrap of Caesar's Gallic Wars the size of P52 or any of these similar fragments. You'd probably throw it in the trash because what's it good for? The fact that the church maintained pieces of paper that had little to no practical value because it considered them holy doesn't tell us anything about whether the things written on them is true. Sure, it gives us a fairly clear picture of what some of the early members of the church wrote, specifically the proto-Orthodox members whose writings ended up being on the right side of later church debates, but it doesn't give us reason to believe what they wrote.
And people have the audacity to question the New Testament. That's ridiculous. If it was a fight, they'd stop it. They wouldn't even let it start. If the Bible is not considered reliable or trustworthy in an institution like this, then there is no ancient document that should ever be considered trustworthy at an institution like this, because none comes close to the Bible.
It's incredibly misinformed and I dare say likely disingenuous to represent this as some kind of double standard. Because when people decide that, say, the Iliad is trustworthy enough to read in schools, they don't mean that it's trustworthy in the sense of being an accurate account of how Olympian gods kept intervening in an implausibly stylized ancient war. They mean it's a reasonably reliable record of ancient Greek stories. They understand the genre of the writing and treat it accordingly. The same happens with the New Testament. It's a reliable record of what some members of the ancient Christian church believed, and academia treats it accordingly. The writings of Caesar and Aristotle are treated the same way. They're considered reliable records of what people wrote, and yes, they contribute something to our understanding of history. But those writings don't wholesale dictate history for us word for word as if the authors had the ability or inclination to give us an inerrant record of the past. That's absurd. No serious historian ever takes a single body of writings as literal inerrant truth. They're understood within the context of their genre, as well as the knowledge and agenda of the authors. So when Voddie wants us to reinvent our entire understanding of history, and reality for that matter, by flatly accepting wild supernatural claims made exclusively by members of a tight-knit first-century cult, he's way overstepping. Nobody accepts the writings of Homer or Caesar or Aristotle on such terms, and it's for the same reason that we don't accept the writings of the New Testament on those terms. It doesn't matter how far back documentation of these claims go. It doesn't matter how many copies of the claim people made centuries later. That's just not how history is done, and when Voddie talks about what we consider reliable and trustworthy to imply there's a double standard, he's just playing with the ambiguity of the words to suggest serious academics aren't consistent if they don't accept supernatural claims on the grounds that the Bible is inerrant. That's just silly, and frankly Voddie and apologists like him should be ashamed for so profoundly contributing to the academic illiteracy of American evangelicalism. And to our society in general. Anyway, we'll finish up next time with part 4. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, Arisma Zaramp, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.